Good morning, my fellow mariners in the One Boat Ministries. Again, great thank you to the Reverend Carrie Pemberton Ford for the invitation to give this reflection. I plan to keep it within 15 minutes today. We talked a little bit last night about some of the work that I'm doing, and Carrie thought it would be interesting to share with you work that I'm doing in terms of Africa's Great Green Wall, which I'll explain later. I describe it sometimes as a wall that the whole world can believe in, because it's a great contrast to the other wall that we've heard so much about on the southern borders of the United States, which is about keeping people out. And I suppose this reflection has its genesis in what we saw happening still a month ago in the United States, in Minnesota, when the former police officer Chauvin knelt on the neck of a black man, George Floyd, and a video was recorded that showed him kneeling for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, almost 9 minutes. And we also heard the words of the dying man pleading for mercy. I can't breathe. Brother, I can't breathe. And then a sure sign that someone is dying. And talked to many former soldiers or medics on the battlefield. It is not unusual for grown men to begin to call for their mama, for their mothers. And we saw this extraordinary callous indifference. And even there was a casualness about it when you looked at Chauvin kneeling there, ignoring the cries of mercy with his hands in his pockets until his victim expired. It wasn't unlike the chase that one might see in a savannah where, lions or tigers or leopards go after a victim, and they go for the neck and for the throat to cut off the airways. It was truly shocking. And it not only shocked the people who were standing around, unable to intervene, and also crying out and pleading that they would show him mercy. But it really resounded right across the United States and the world in a way that we haven't seen for a long time. Even the fact that the African Union felt compelled to actually issue a statement in relation to racism in the United States, the first time, I think, since 1964. So that tells us a lot. And I thought a lot about George Floyd, and I have a very good friend called Andrew Edwards, who I believe is one of the great sculptors of the United Kingdom today. I've worked with him on a number of important public monuments. Some people will be aware of as the Beatles statues in Liverpool. He's done what is considered one of the greatest sporting monuments outside what used to be the Britannia Stadium. It's now Bet365 in Stoke of Sir Stanley Matthews. And I worked with him on a monument to my great boyhood hero, the great England goalkeeper, Gordon Banks. In fact, subject to correction, I think I may be the first Irishman who has ever put a monument up to an Englishman. And it's something I'm very proud of, because Gordon Banks had a profound and very positive influence on my childhood, my adolescence, particularly growing up in the north of Ireland during the Troubles. So when I saw George Floyd, when I saw his death, and I witnessed the uprising of anger all across the United States and indeed across the world. I sent a text to Andy, and I says, Andy, a monument to George Floyd. And it was very interesting how Andy Edwards came back and he said, you know, Don, we're in a new era and we have to be careful how art is perceived, particularly art that is perceived as an expression of empire. And of course, we're aware of so many monuments, you know, that many of the great empires have put up to people who we now look back on history at, and we question their values, their morals, and indeed the narrative that has told us that they were great people, but in fact we know that they have done some horrendous things. And there was one in terms of Brussels, the de facto capital of the European Union, of King Leopold II. And I had seen over the years former Congolese migrants and some Belgian people who were asking for this particular equestrian monument to be taken down. And indeed, in the aftermath of George Floyd and the fact that a number of monuments were actually torn down, we saw it in Bristol, and were removed by civil authorities in different parts of the world. I wrote a letter to the Irish Times suggesting that Irish MEPs should actually support the calls of many African people and the calls of Belgian people to have the monuments to Leopold II removed. Why? Because to me, to have someone like Leopold II anywhere in the world, but particularly in the capital of the European Union, being honoured in the way that he is, and these were put up to honour the memory of this man, then I think that it's a huge hurt and a huge historical insult to the people of Africa, and particularly to the people of the Congo. It's estimated that this man was directly responsible for the murder of 10 million Congolese people, as well as the mutilation of millions of other people who didn't bring in their rubber quotas. And of course, we look all over Europe and we can see the symbols of empire and the great wealth that really was stolen from particularly Africa, but other so-called third world continents. So I think this is a time of profound reflection. And Andy made me think, and he talked about, you know, in today's climate, if we're going to do something, it needs to be done with many hands. A lot of people cooperating. And of course, I'm not interested just simply in the tearing down of monuments. I think that we need to do something that causes us to reflect on what's happening. So maybe as one contributor to One Boat Ministry suggested, is that the statue maybe would be thrown in a corner of the great park where it takes such honoured place, so that it makes people question, why has this been torn down? And of course then it allows us to begin to talk about the horrendous history that this particular character visited upon innocent people in the heart of Africa, and so on. I mean, in terms of all of the other monuments, including the one that was torn down in Bristol and pulled through the streets and eventually thrown into the sea. In some ways, I mean, Lewis Hamilton even made a very interesting tweet, you know, that I think he was, and certainly someone compared the dumping of this statue in bronze into the sea, comparing it to the 1.5 million people who were literally thrown overboard from slave ships that were making their way to the Americas from Africa because they were deemed to be too sick or disease-ridden, and were in danger of infecting other slaves. And so they were literally, mercilessly, just simply dumped over for the sharks. Horrendous. So I began to think, what would be an appropriate way to memorialize George Floyd, and in a way that would use a lot of hands, as Andy had suggested. And my idea then began to expand. And I thought of a memorial that actually could also speak to the pleas for mercy of George Floyd, to the indifference of Officer Chauvin. I can't breathe. Brother, I can't breathe. And I thought of a memorial that actually could breathe. A memorial that is one of life, and which is life-giving. And of course that memorial would be a tree or trees. And then I began to think of not just George Floyd, but all the souls that were stolen from Africa, 12.5 million over a 300-year period, brought as cheap labour across the Atlantic to North America, to Central America, to South America, and to run the plantations that made European colonizers extremely wealthy. And then I thought, wouldn't it be extraordinary if we were to, in some ways, memorialize all of those souls who were stolen? And I then began to think of Africa's Great Green Wall. The Sahara Desert, because of global warming and climate breakdown, has been encroaching further south. And it's in danger now of overwhelming this very delicate ecosystem known as the Sahel, which is almost like a buffer zone between the severity of the Sahara Desert and the savannas to the south. And there are maybe up to 60 million people who are in danger of being forced to become climate refugees in the coming decades, unless we somehow manage to hold the Sahara back and regenerate degraded lands. And so the African Union, they've come up with this extraordinary idea. It's called the Great Green Wall, where a green buffer zone would be created right across the entire African continent, traversing some 8,000 kilometers, 5,000 miles from Senegal in the west to the Republic of Djibouti on the east coast. And it would be maybe 14 kilometers deep. When completed, it will be the longest living organism on the planet, 3 times larger than the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. It will be a new world wonder, and in fact it will be visible from space. So it's an extraordinary, ambitious project that actually addresses 15 of the 17 sustainable development goals. And what I love about it is that it's an African initiative. So it's coming from the African people, the African soul. It's not the Chinese, it's not the Americans, it's not former European colonizers who are suggesting to Africa that this might be a good idea. But this is a response to global warming that really can be one of the great inspirational projects, environmental projects on the planet today. And already I can see in Europe and in America, in other places, that people are looking at the Great Green Wall and being very inspired by it. I just saw an article in the BBC. I read it actually this morning about tree planting just for the sake of putting lots of trees in the grounds isn't necessarily the best way to try and combat the whole issue of global warming or the sequestering of carbon. It has to be the right trees. And one of the important things about the Great Green Wall is that it's scientifically based. So, for example, the Kew Gardens are one of the scientific institutes that are actually helping to advise in terms of this great tapestry that will cross the African continent, to make sure that it's indigenous trees and trees that are good for that environment and that will help to increase and sustain biodiversity, as well as regenerating lands and creating green jobs and providing opportunities for communities to stay together, and particularly for young people to know that they can have a future. And indeed, the Great Green Wall is going to be extended all over Africa. Branches of it will go into the other dry lands as well. So it's really an important project that I've decided to give, if God spares me, the next 10 years of my life to. So the idea, I'm now in discussions with the African Union and also with a wonderful organisation. In fact, we should try and get Dr. William Smith at some stage to actually speak here on the One Boat Ministries. He created an organisation called the National Centre for Race Amity. Smitty is a wonderful African-American man. He made it to Sports Illustrated as one of the first black college sportsmen to actually be written about in Sports Illustrated. And he actually went to the Vietnam War. He was drafted, and he, as a Baha'i, he actually could have pleaded as a conscientious objector, certainly not using bone spurs, but rather his faith as a reason why he should not go. But he could see that around him, many of his community were literally being forced to go to Vietnam because of the draft. And so he said, I'm going, but I'm not going to carry a weapon. And he went as a medic with a combat unit. And he doesn't talk a lot, but you can see he witnessed a lot and a lot of pain. So Smitty has created this National Centre for Race Amity, which is looking at the fact that throughout history there has always been good people on the other side. The same in terms of the vexed history between Ireland and England, or Ireland and Britain. There were always good English people and good British people, and indeed some of our great heroes in Irish history are people from the Anglo-Irish community. And Smitty's idea is that we seek those friends and we build those bridges, because that's where healing will be the foundation of the healing that is so necessary for moving forward. So I want to help Smitty's work, and there needs to be this dialogue going on in the United States about, race and racism, and indeed even an amendment that is so necessary to the 13th Amendment, which has resulted in more African American people being in prison today than there were African slaves in the United States during the terrible days of slavery. And the idea is that we will create a living monument to the 12.5 million people who were stolen from Africa. And the living monument will be along the Great Green Wall. And the idea is that we will bring 100 trees, native trees of course, back through the door on Gorey Island, which is known as the door of no return, because many of the slaves, once they walked through that door onto a plank which brought them onto the ships that would take them to the Americas, they knew that once they walked through that door, they would never see Africa again. It's one of the saddest places in the world that I've ever visited. So symbolically, it's like bringing those great souls back. And 100 trees on Gorey Island, and then we would begin a highway from Dakar up to the beginning of the Great Green Wall and then plant, the 12.5 million trees moving across the Sahara as a life-giving and a living memorial, and also as a statement that those souls who were stolen, that their memory can also become a source of inspiration for us to help Africa to rediscover its soul. Anyway, there are just some thoughts in relation to that. And Reverend Kerry Pemberton Ford, when we talked about this presentation yesterday, suggested that a poem that would be wonderful to end with would be the great poem by Maya Angelou, When Great Trees Fall. So I would like to end this reflection by reading the entire poem of Maya Angelou, and Kerry will put it up afterwards on the Facebook page so that you can read it again if you want and ponder it again. But I think it's really beautiful, and I thank you for listening to my presentation this morning, and again, thanks to Kerry for the invitation to share with you. And the idea is, how do we create memorials that really are appropriate, that are counterculture, that make us think, that no longer glorify war, or indeed people who have become powerful and wealthy through the exploitation and indeed the genocide of other people. We have to find new ways. So the idea of the forest along the Great Green Wall in memory of those great souls who were stolen from Africa, I hope that it resonates with others and that it can become an inspiration for a new springtime across the entire continent of Africa, Mother Africa, where 98% of our DNA can be traced back to, where all of humanity began. And it's so sad and horrendous that, the ignorance that causes us to have such prejudice against African people and to look down upon them. People who have incredible dexterity for multiple languages. Good people from whom we can learn a lot. So with that, let me conclude with Maya Angelou's When Great Trees Fall. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grass, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly, our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory, suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality, bound to them, takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. Thank you, my friends, and God bless you.